It was late, too late, and Ruby could feel the exhaustion creeping through her every pore. She had just finished her shift at the factory, and now stood alone at the bus stop, the streetlights casting long shadows that stretched into the night. The silence around her felt heavy, almost suffocating. The city was quiet at this hour, the hum of late-night traffic the only reminder that life still moved outside this isolated moment. She glanced down the empty street, waiting for the bus, her mind drifting to the things she couldn't afford to forget. Her daughter, Angela, alone in their tiny apartment. A pang of guilt squeezed her chest. Ruby hated leaving her daughter, but work was work. Bills were bills. The wait felt endless, and with every passing minute her eyelids grew heavier. But then, in the distance, she saw it. The bus, its headlights cutting through the dark like a beacon, lumbered toward her. She dragged herself upright, brushed the cold from her tired shoulders, and made her way to the doors. The bus creaked to a stop, its hydraulic doors opening with a loud hiss. The driver, a burly man with unkempt hair and a permanent scowl, greeted her with a grunt. Ruby fumbled through her bag, searching for the change. Her hands were sluggish, too tired to move efficiently. The driver sighed impatiently, his eyes rolling as he waited for her to find the right coins. She finally handed over the fare, muttering a quiet apology. The doors slammed shut behind her, and the bus jerked to life, pulling away from the curb and beginning its slow, monotonous journey through the streets. Ruby shuffled down the aisle, found an empty seat at the back, and sank into it, her body sagging with the weight of exhaustion. The bus rattled along, the engine groaning under the strain of its age. The familiar route felt more like a dream than reality as she stared out the window, the city lights flickering past in a blur. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, the weariness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her eyes closed, just for a moment. She didn't mean to fall asleep. But the lull of the bus, the steady hum of the engine, the gentle sway of the vehicle, before she knew it, her head had slipped to the side, resting against the cool glass of the window. The city outside grew quieter, and Ruby drifted into a light, restless slumber. It wasn't long before something woke her, a sudden shift in the atmosphere. She didn't know how long she had been asleep, but something was wrong. A chill ran down her spine, and she blinked, struggling to focus her blurry eyes. For a moment, the bus seemed empty, eerily so. But as the lights flickered above her, she realized she was not alone. Someone was sitting next to her. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. She had checked before, hadn't she? The bus was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers. But now, a figure sat beside her, their form hunched forward, face obscured by the dark hood of a jacket. She could barely make out their features, but something about them sent a chill through her veins. Was this person new? She couldn't remember seeing them board the bus, and they hadn't been there when she first sat down. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. It wasn't unusual for people to board at odd hours, but this felt different. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to avoid looking directly at them. But her curiosity got the better of her. She turned her head, pretending to glance out the window while her peripheral vision took in the strange figure beside her. They sat completely still, head bowed, their face hidden beneath the hood of their dark jacket. The jacket itself was out of place, a heavy winter coat, despite the warm summer night. Ruby's heart beat faster. She couldn't shake the sense of unease that crept over her. She forced herself to breathe, tried to reassure herself that it was nothing more than the fatigue playing tricks on her mind. But then a sound, a faint, unsettling noise, reached her ears. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The noise was coming from the figure next to her, the sound of nails dragging against the fabric of the seat, scraping it in a slow, agonizing rhythm. Ruby stiffened, her body frozen in place, her mind screaming at her to get up and move, but she couldn't. It was as if her legs were made of lead. She forced herself to turn away, to look out the window again, trying to shake the feeling of discomfort. But it wouldn't leave her. The sound persisted, the scraping growing louder, more frantic. Could she say something? Ask them to stop? Ruby didn't know what to do. She glanced down at her hands, unsure if she could find the words to break the silence. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her mouth. Could you stop that?" she said, her voice trembling. But the scratching continued. "Please stop," she said, her voice more forceful this time. Still, nothing. The figure remained motionless, as if they hadn't heard her at all. Ruby's pulse quickened, the unease in her stomach turning to full-blown anxiety. What was happening? Who was this person? Before she could gather the courage to say anything else, the bus jerked, and Ruby's attention snapped back to the outside world. The streetlights blurred as the bus swerved, the tires screeching against the road. Ruby gripped the edge of her seat, her breath catching in her throat. Was this the end of her journey? Ruby's hands tightened around the seat as the bus continued to swerve and shake. The engine growled like an animal, the vibrations running through her body, rattling her bones. She could hear the wheels screeching against the asphalt as the bus took sharp corners, its momentum jerking her back and forth. But the real discomfort, the one that seemed to reach into her very soul, was the figure next to her. The scratching sound had stopped, but the presence beside her was still palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ruby could feel the weight of it, the unspoken tension that pressed on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She dared not look at the figure again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, waiting. Was this some sort of prank? A sick joke? But Ruby knew better than to entertain such thoughts. This wasn't a joke. This was real, and it felt wrong in ways that defied explanation. She glanced at the empty seats ahead of her, the ones that had once been occupied by the few late-night commuters. But now, there was no one else. The bus was barren, save for her and the strange figure beside her. The driver was still focused on the road, his eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the unsettling presence that had taken hold of the vehicle. Ruby's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. She wasn't alone. Of that she was certain. But who was this person? What did they want? And why had they chosen to sit next to her? Her thoughts spiraled as the bus continued its erratic journey, each turn more unpredictable than the last. The noise of the engine, the squeak of the tires, the hiss of the doors, it all blurred together, creating an atmosphere of disorientation that made Ruby's stomach churn. Was she dreaming? Was this real? She could feel her heartbeat in her throat now, pounding in her chest as she took slow, deliberate breaths. The cold, clammy sweat clung to her skin, and she could feel her clothes sticking to her back. She couldn't focus on anything but the figure beside her, the looming presence that seemed to shift with every passing moment. Then, just as Ruby thought she might lose control, the figure beside her stirred. The hooded stranger shifted in their seat, a faint rustling of fabric. Ruby's breath caught, and she instinctively shifted away, pressing herself further into the corner of the bus. She stared straight ahead, her eyes wide, her body tense. Was this it? Was the figure going to speak? Or was something worse about to happen? The seconds dragged on like hours. Ruby's thoughts were scrambled, tangled in a web of fear and confusion. She had to get off this bus. She had to get home. She couldn't let this feeling of dread consume her, but the more she tried to push it away, the more it gripped her. Finally, the figure spoke, their voice low and hoarse, barely a whisper. "It's getting cold in here," they said. Ruby's blood ran cold at the sound of the words. There was something wrong in the way they spoke, something off about their tone. It wasn't an ordinary comment about the temperature. It felt like a warning, like a cryptic message that Ruby couldn't quite decipher. Before she could respond, the figure fell silent again, their heads still bowed. Ruby fought the urge to look at them, afraid of what she might see. But the silence between them was unbearable. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of her seat, trying to steady herself. She couldn't stand the quiet, the tension that hung thick in the air. She glanced at the window again, trying to lose herself in the reflection of the city lights outside. But when she did, her stomach lurched. The figure, Its reflection was now staring directly at her. Ruby's breath caught in her throat as she froze, unable to tear her eyes away from the window. The reflection in the glass showed her own face, pale and tired. But there was something else in the reflection. Something she couldn't explain. The figure beside her was looking at her through the glass, its hood now drawn back slightly, enough for Ruby to see the faint outline of a face that was both unfamiliar and yet terrifyingly close. For a moment, Ruby felt like she was losing touch with reality. The figure's features were hidden in shadows, but the eyes, those eyes, seemed to pierce through her, searching her soul. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and a wave of nausea washed over her. She couldn't explain it. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew that this was not normal. This was not something she could just brush off. Her thoughts were racing, and her heart was hammering in her chest. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to say something. She had to break the silence. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply sat there, unmoving, its head lowered again as if it hadn't heard her. But Ruby felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a sensation that was impossible to ignore. With every passing second, the air in the bus seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. Ruby could feel her pulse in her ears, the sound of her heartbeat drowning out everything else. The figure's presence was like a weight on her chest, suffocating her with its unnerving stillness. The bus shuddered as it took another corner, but Ruby's attention was fixed solely on the figure beside her. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And then, just as she thought she might lose her mind, the bus took a sharp turn, and everything went black. Ruby's eyes snapped open, but she couldn't remember falling asleep. The darkness outside the window had deepened, and the hum of the engine was now a distant, muffled sound that barely registered in her foggy mind. Her body was trembling, but not from the cold. No, it was something deeper, something primal. She could feel it now, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The bus had stopped. Ruby's eyes flickered around, searching for some sign of where they were. The city lights were gone, replaced by an oppressive blackness that swallowed everything outside the bus. The streets, the buildings, they were all gone. In their place was nothing but an empty void, an unsettling silence that felt more like a void than the quiet of a late-night ride. "Where are we?" Ruby whispered to herself, her voice cracking in the stillness. She turned slowly, her neck stiff, and felt her heart skip a beat. The figure, no, the passenger, was still there, sitting next to her, its head bowed low, obscured by the shadow of its hood. Ruby's pulse quickened, and for a split second she considered getting up and running, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Every fiber of her being screamed to get away, but her body refused to cooperate. Then, as if sensing her growing unease, the figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its head. The air around Ruby seemed to freeze, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The darkness inside the bus seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. She tried to make out the figure's face, but all she could see were two glowing eyes, black and endless. No, they weren't eyes at all. They were just empty voids, devoid of any humanity. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the true nature of what sat next to her. This was no ordinary passenger. It wasn't even human. Ruby's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind scrambled for answers, for any explanation to make sense of what she was seeing. She turned her head quickly, her eyes darting to the window, desperate to distract herself from the terror that was beginning to take hold of her. The reflection in the glass sent a shockwave of panic through her. The figure beside her didn't move, but in the glass, its reflection was contorted, twisted in ways that defied nature. The face, no, the thing in the seat next to her, had elongated features, its mouth hanging wide open in a grotesque, silent scream. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, but they weren't just looking at Ruby. No, they were searching for something inside her. Ruby's heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming, or if she had somehow slipped into a nightmare, but one thing was certain. She was trapped. The door to the bus, the only escape, was nowhere to be seen. The driver's cabin was locked, and the windows. She tried to push them open, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if the bus had been swallowed by the night, leaving them stranded in a space that was both empty and endless. Suddenly, the figure leaned closer. Its breath, cold and rancid, sent a shudder through Ruby's entire body. She could feel it, the presence of it, just inches away from her ear. But when she turned to look, there was nothing. Nothing but the empty, soulless stare of the figure that hadn't moved an inch. Ruby's mind was reeling. She didn't know what was real anymore, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't let this thing get any closer. The door, the escape, it was the only thing that mattered now. She had to get out, no matter what. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Ruby jumped up from her seat and bolted for the front of the bus. Her legs were unsteady, her vision blurred with fear. But she didn't care. She had to escape. She had to make it to the front door. But just as she reached the aisle, the bus lurched violently, throwing her off balance. She stumbled, crashing into the seat in front of her, her body slamming against the metal frame. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Panic surged in her chest as she scrambled to regain her footing. The bus shuddered again, the engine roaring to life with a deafening growl. Ruby's heart pounded in her ears as the vehicle lurched forward, speeding down a road she didn't recognize. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a path that seemed endless. The city had vanished, replaced by a vast, empty expanse that stretched into the night. Ruby's mind raced. Where was the bus going? Why had it left the city? She felt herself growing dizzy, her thoughts spiraling as the bus sped faster and faster, its wheels screeching against the pavement. She tried to steady herself, gripping the seat in front of her for support, but the world around her seemed to tilt and spin. The darkness was swallowing them whole. And then, as the bus careened down the road, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost inaudible over the roar of the engine, but Ruby heard it clearly. "Not yet," it whispered. The words sent a jolt of terror through Ruby's spine, freezing her to the spot. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her body refused to move. The figure's words hung in the air like a chilling omen, and Ruby knew with a bone-deep certainty that whatever this thing was, it wasn't here by accident. It had been waiting for her. Ruby's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tightening with every passing second. She gripped the seat in front of her, her knuckles white as the bus careened down the darkened road. The figure beside her remained still, silent, its presence like a shadow that refused to leave. The words it had whispered, "Not yet," repeated in her mind like a haunting echo. Not yet. What did it mean? Why was this happening to her? Her thoughts were fragmented, a chaotic mess that she couldn't untangle. The cold sweat on her skin felt clammy, the terror gnawing at her insides. She had to escape. She had to get off the bus. But as the bus tore through the darkness, the world outside grew increasingly unfamiliar, an endless void that swallowed every trace of civilization. There were no streetlights now, no buildings, no signs of life. The bus was no longer part of the city. It was somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body on high alert as her mind raced for answers. She knew she wasn't alone. The figure beside her, the thing beside her, was still there, watching her. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Every time she dared to glance at it, her skin crawled, and she felt the grip of panic tighten around her throat. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, just let me go." But the figure didn't respond. It never did. It just sat there, its hood still drawn low over its face, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for her to understand. The bus jolted as it hit a pothole, and Ruby stumbled forward, her hands reaching out for something to steady herself. She could feel the bus picking up speed, faster and faster, as if it had a mind of its own. The engine roared, drowning out everything else, and Ruby's head spun. Was this a dream? Was she trapped in some nightmare that wouldn't end? She stumbled down the aisle, the bus now a blur of motion. The doors were still locked. The windows wouldn't open. She couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the bus screeched to a halt. The sudden stop threw Ruby forward, her body slamming against the front of the bus. She gasped for air, the world spinning around her as she struggled to regain her balance. Where are we? She whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and barely audible. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence that hung in the air like a dense fog. Ruby's hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the floor, glancing around in a daze. She could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her chest. The doors. She had to get to the doors. She had to escape. But when she turned to run, she froze. The figure was standing in the aisle, blocking her way. It was taller now, its silhouette more menacing in the dim light. The hood had fallen back slightly, revealing a face that was both familiar and utterly foreign. There was something wrong with it, something grotesque. The features were twisted, the eyes hollow and black, staring at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Ruby tried to back away, but the figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. The air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. She could feel her body trembling, the terror seeping into every pore. "Why are you doing this?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with one hand, its fingers long, distorted, and unnaturally thin. The nails, sharp and yellowed, scraped across the floor as it moved closer. Ruby's heart pounded in her chest, and panic surged through her like a tidal wave. She turned to flee, but the doors were still locked. She slammed her fists against the metal, screaming for help, but there was no one to hear her. The figure was too close now. She could feel its breath on her skin, cold and rancid, and a strange tingling sensation crawled down her spine. It was as if it were pulling her in, drawing her closer with some invisible force. "No!" Ruby cried out, her voice breaking. "Please stop!" But the figure didn't stop. It never stopped. It reached out, its gnarled hand hovering just inches from her face. Ruby's body went cold, her limbs frozen in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She was trapped. And then, as if on cue, the figure spoke again, its voice like the rasp of nails on a chalkboard. "Not yet, but soon." The words sent a shock through Ruby's system, a jolt of pure terror that flooded her body. She couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary passenger. This was no ordinary ride. This was something else. The doors. The doors had to open. She had to get away before it was too late. With every ounce of strength she had left, Ruby hurled herself against the driver's cabin, her hands pounding against the glass. She screamed, begged, pleaded for the driver to wake up, to open the doors, to save her. But there was no answer. The driver remained motionless, his body limp and unmoving. He wasn't just unconscious, he was gone. Gone, like everything else. The figure behind her moved again, its hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. The coldness of its fingers sent a wave of ice through her skin. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, the figure lunged. Ruby's scream tore through the silence, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating her with every desperate breath she took. The figure's hand was on her shoulder now, its cold, dead fingers digging into her flesh, pulling her closer. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But her body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt as if her very soul was being drained from her. The figure's eyes, those empty black pits, were fixed on her, unwavering, unblinking. It was as if it were waiting for something, waiting for her to understand. "No," Ruby managed to whisper, her voice shaking, her body trembling beneath the pressure of its grip. "What do you want from me?" The figure's mouth opened, and Ruby recoiled in horror. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, a jagged, gaping hole filled with rows of sharp, uneven teeth. The air around her turned cold, colder than she had ever known, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill. Her breath came out in shaky clouds, the frost forming in the air. The bus lurched again, its engine roaring like a beast from the depths of hell. Ruby felt her mind start to unravel, the walls closing in around her. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. She was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The figure leaned in closer, its distorted face almost touching hers. The rancid smell of decay filled the air, overwhelming her senses, but Ruby couldn't look away. She couldn't tear her gaze from its eyes, those endless, bottomless voids that seemed to swallow everything they touched. Then, in a voice that sent a chill deep into her bones, the figure spoke again. "It's not yet your time," it hissed. "But soon, soon, you will understand." Ruby's heart stopped. Not yet your time? What did that mean? Was this some sort of warning? Was it trying to tell her something? Her mind spun with confusion as the figure's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, until its fingers were inches from her face. And then, suddenly, it was gone. The bus jerked violently, throwing Ruby forward as the lights flickered. She screamed in panic, her mind still reeling from the creature's words, from the terror that had gripped her entire being. But when she opened her eyes, everything had changed. The figure was gone. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by the soft glow of city lights outside the window. The bus was once again on its normal route, the familiar streets of the city stretching out before her. Ruby blinked in disbelief, her hands trembling as she pushed herself up from the floor, her breath ragged, as if she had just woken from a nightmare. She looked around. The bus was empty, just as it had been when she first boarded. The driver, he was still there, seated behind the wheel, his eyes focused on the road. But there was no sign of the figure, no trace of the terrifying creature that had haunted her moments ago. Ruby's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was she losing her mind? She reached out, her hands still shaking, and fumbled for the bus's emergency stop button. She had to get off. She couldn't stay on this bus any longer. She had to find a way out. But as she pressed the button, the bus did not stop. The doors remained closed, locked. Ruby's panic grew as the world around her seemed to blur, her vision flickering. The city outside was no longer familiar. It was dark and distorted, a twisted version of the world she knew. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, she saw it. In the seat where the figure had once sat, etched into the wood of the seat was a message. The words were crude, hastily scratched into the surface, but they were unmistakable. Not yet. Ruby's blood ran cold. She stared at the message, her mind reeling. The figure had been real. Everything had been real. The terror, the creature, the whispers, it was all happening. And the message, it wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Not yet. But if not yet, then when? The bus continued its journey, speeding through the streets of the city, but Ruby didn't feel safe anymore. The reality of what had just happened settled into her bones, a cold weight that she couldn't shake. She had escaped the figure, but it was still with her. It wasn't gone. Not yet. Ruby glanced at the driver, but there was no comfort to be found there. He didn't even seem to notice the shift in the air, the unease that hung in the bus like a cloud. The passengers were gone. There was only her, the driver, and the endless road ahead. She was trapped in this endless loop, a prisoner of something far darker than she could ever imagine. As the bus continued on its way, Ruby sat back in her seat, her heart racing, her hands cold and trembling. She had survived this encounter, but for how long? Not yet. And in that moment, Ruby understood. This wasn't just about the figure. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was only the beginning.